I'd be happy to take questions if you guys are still awake. Any questions? Okay, there's going to be a quiz at lunch. Okay.
Ok. Leslie, la verdad que es una excelente presentación. Me quedaron dos dudas menores realmente. En el sentido de que veía cierto solapamiento entre el nivel 1 y el 3, porque la administración del programa realmente ocurre, me cuesta partirla, ¿sí? Y después entre el nivel 3 y el 4. Si pudieras profundizar un poquito más en eso. El resto fue muy claro.
Thank you. I think that's a good observation and a good question. The paper tries to give some really concrete examples of things, particularly between level 1 and level 2, you said, level 1 and level 3. Level 1 is things like having a REDD focal point, the administrative costs of having a REDD team that administers the actual program. It includes, the cost to go and negotiate. It's very specific to the REDD administration. This is the view that we have, and I think it is up to each, government to determine where that line is. Whereas those things have nothing necessarily to do with actually producing an emission reduction. Granted, if you don't go to UNFCCC, who cares about producing an emission reduction? But so I think for me, level 1, if you cannot attach any impact on emission reductions to that, but it's still part of the cost of putting your program together, things like the reference emission level. Doing that does not bring you one emission reduction, but you can't have a REDD program without it. That's a cost I'd put up in number 1. Or the ongoing MRV of that. If you do actually do third-party verification, the cost of verifying, they don't produce one emission reduction. I think our view on the subprograms, so level 3, was they really are the things that promote change on the ground. And all of the countries that in the region have wonderful programs. I gave PES as one example, but every time I talk to someone, I learn something new about programs. So that may not be the perfect definition, but that's what we had in mind. And then the difference between 3 and 4, was that the other question? Yeah. I think that one is I wouldn't call it an arbitrary difference, but we look at 3 as government facing and government costs. We look at 4 as land managers' costs. And they're linked. And in fact, there's a section in the paper where we talk about the linking between level 3 and 4. So it really is who ends up bearing the cost. So that's the way we differentiate that. Other questions?
Yeah, Leslie, thank you very much. I think that was a very impressive presentation, and the level of detail of disaggregating the costs and revenues of REDD programs is very, very useful. And I couldn't agree with you more that it's an important tool to actually inform governments in their negotiations of ERPAs and the price of carbon, and I really appreciate that, having been in some of these discussions in the past. But my question to you is, well, how long do you think it would take to roll out such an exercise in a given country, and has that started yet, given that at least in our programs we are now entering, so to speak, this negotiation phase, and so are there any pilots already underway doing this exercise?
Thanks for that question. And so we literally just finished putting this together, 2 nights ago. And that's why when you read the draft, you'll see that it's a little rough. That said, we, under RCCP, are currently working with both Guatemala and Costa Rica, but we've literally just started. And Guatemala, we sort of went for the first time and took what they had done, which was a good budgeting process, and worked to put that into this framework to see if it worked. And in fact, Jacobo showed you sort of the levels, the 4 levels that they had done. So we're starting to pilot it, and the time it would take, I think in part depends on how well developed the inputs are. So in cases where there's already been some fairly detailed financial planning and the main strategic options that specify which policies, subprograms, and activities are the highest priorities, I think the process takes, 4 or 5 months, maybe even 3. I mean, because it means producing a set of models that work together, and we may, for example, highlight that this particular subsector, which is an important subprogram, we have really basic data on. But that doesn't mean we don't have a plan that works, that has some assumptions in it. I think that, again, we would want to see that as ongoing, and the approach that we're trying to take is that the model becomes something that lives and is owned within the government agencies that are responsible for financial planning, but we're still just at it. So some might take much longer. If there's no inputs, you can't, if you don't know what you're doing and you don't have the inputs, you can't financially plan. So that's why we're very fortunate to be working initially with both Costa Rica and Guatemala, because their programs are much farther along. And in fact, that's probably why this kind of workshop is relevant now, because we have a number of the countries that are they're in, this is what they need to do. So I hope that answers your question. Any other questions?
Gracias, Leslie. Creo que fue muy buena tu presentación, y yo creo que estos elementos del plan financiero son clave para poder establecer la fase de pago por resultados, ¿no? Mi duda va en la línea de establecer cómo se logra establecer, por ejemplo, para el caso de Guatemala, mayores inversiones del Estado hacia actividades que en algún momento se están proponiendo que sean actividades REDD, y cómo se puede dar ese fortalecimiento presupuestario del Estado, porque en la práctica no está pasando eso. O sea, en la práctica van a venir muchos recursos de cooperación, préstamos, como las fuentes que ustedes establecen, pero van a quedar posiblemente fuera de los presupuestos del Estado, y la maquinaria del presupuesto del Estado, sabiendo lo complicado que es, ¿cómo podría hacerse una mezcla, podríamos llamarle? Ya se están haciendo algunos ejercicios en este tema de fortalecimiento presupuestario, pero yo creo que el gran desafío está en la línea de mantener esa línea de fortalecimiento presupuestario de las inversiones del Estado con otras fuentes, y cómo se logra que ese porcentaje de inversión del Estado vaya aumentando gradualmente. O sea, esa sería tal vez mi duda en el tema de cómo adaptar esto a lograr un fortalecimiento presupuestario del gobierno.
Thank you, and I'm going to ask a clarifying question. Was your question focused primarily on how to account for state spending, state sources of funds? Because you used the word investment, and I just wanted to make sure I understood your question. Is it around how do we determine which national funds are part of this budgeting process? ¿Sí?
Sí, básicamente porque la propuesta de Guatemala va en la línea de que las inversiones que tiene el Estado actualmente en actividades que posiblemente están proponiendo que sean actividades REDD, ya tienen un presupuesto del Estado. Lo que necesitamos ahora es el fortalecimiento presupuestario para que haya más recursos y se pueda transformar esas actividades en posiblemente mayores recursos para tener mayores proyectos, hasta el tema de actividades al nivel 4. ¿Cómo transformar ese fortalecimiento presupuestario, podemos llamarlo así, real, y en la práctica que en realidad suceda un fortalecimiento presupuestario?
So I think I'm going to answer the question you asked. So budgetary strengthening was the translation I got. Does that mean how do you bring in more funds to complement state funds? Okay. Sorry for the translation. The translation is good. I just wanted to make sure I understood. So the ability to see how your state funds play into and create certain financial metrics for different parts of your national program will allow you to determine which sets of activities may be appropriate for potentially a public-private partnership where you combine state funds with private sector funds to mobilize what you need to implement. So that's an example, is as you see what is financially feasible, you may also see, for example, I'm just going to say that there's a subsector that you want to promote increased productivity. You know, I can't think of one. It could have been timber, it could be coffee, it could be cocoa, but you want to actually, within the country, increase the productivity and the profitability of that sector. And to do that, you need to invest in the value chain of that sector, right? You need to figure out how to make sure it's efficient to get increased productivity, increased plants that have increased productivity. You need to figure out how to potentially build processing plants that are close by, or transportation. And you identify that as, if you do that, then that sector becomes a much more attractive sector for private sector investment. That hopefully your financial planning process gives you that information. That would then allow you to figure out, can you attract private sector investors to help pay for that up front? Because over the long term, you can show they're going to get a return. You may also say, we're going to, because it's in these municipalities, it's mainly in these 3 or 4 municipalities, we're going to do a municipal bond issuance to get money, project finance money, to make those value chain or supply chain investments. And we know we're going to be able to pay it back because our cooperatives are going to give us a portion of their revenue. Those are just examples of things that we hope you would find out. Luis, is there anything you want to add? Because you may have understood the question better than I did. I don't know, were you in the room for the question? You were, right? Luis, you might want to add something to that.
Sí, en realidad va a depender mucho de la mecánica que se planifique para la distribución de los beneficios que genere REDD, ¿verdad? Y va a depender mucho de sus arreglos iniciales que se tengan y también de las actividades adicionales que el gobierno planifica a nivel de los subprogramas, ¿sí? Entonces, puede ser que el rol, como hablábamos, de un focal point esté en el nivel administrativo y que producto de los nuevos ingresos que REDD genere, se genere esos ingresos adicionales para ese tipo de actividades específicas, las representaciones del país ante la conferencia de las partes, la administración financiera misma que va a requerir el manejo de esa nueva adición de ingresos al país. Y también cómo se va a poder financiar los subprogramas, ¿sí?, que el gobierno implemente. Digamos, si hay un nuevo programa de extensión, por ejemplo, como algo que INAV quiere hacer, como mejorar los servicios de extensión al manejo forestal, vas a tener que tener un costo adicional, y ese costo adicional va a tener que tener una nueva fuente de ingresos. Y puede ser que esa nueva fuente de ingresos venga del financiamiento REDD, si es que esa nueva fuente de financiamiento soporta la generación de reducciones de emisiones adicionales. Entonces va a ser un poquito, creo que eso va a ser un tema, lo conversamos con Leslie, que era un tema un poco de estructuración financiera y que era necesario evaluarlo caso por caso, país por país, porque los arreglos son distintos en cada país y la forma como cada país, su institucionalidad y su sector privado y sus manejadores de tierras funcionan son distintos.
Okay. Franz? There you go.
Muchas gracias, Leslie, por una excelente presentación y desmistificar plan financiero de REDD. Creo que eso ha sido bien obvio que lo lograste. Gracias. La pregunta mía es muy sencilla. Tú dijiste que te gustaría ver y que soñás que algún día la reducción de emisiones sean un commodity. Why?
Because commodities have value and have a market and have people that will buy them and provide a payback for those people who produce them. It's a value that should be attributed to those who produce emission reductions. So I don't mean a commodity in the bad sense, like one emission reduction is exactly the same as another, because as we know in the land use sector, they each come with unique co-benefits along with those. But until it's treated more like a commodity, that is, has value, that can be traded like a commodity, there's no way that we'll get large-scale private sector participation. So, and that's only, like, it's a very important part of the overall finance, not to take away the importance of state budgets, of donors, of results-based programs. I mean, we look at the results-based programs as we're very fortunate to have this sort of hybrid, interim, fairly sizable amount of demand for results-based, which, of course it goes shy of being a market per se, but in the absence of having, whether they're domestic markets or international markets or bilateral agreements, it is the one thing that will actually pay for all the work that you and your land managers are doing. So I think, is that it? One more question? Jason? Absolutely.
I'll just speak on one. Thank you very much for the really interesting presentation. One quick question was, why does REDD enforcement have to be separate? You had mentioned that before, that when governments think about enforcement, that they need to separate enforcement for REDD from the rest of their enforcement activities. Why would that be? And what's an example of that?
Yeah, I think that's probably the lack of clarity in the way I presented it there. What I meant is, in many places we see that laws are in place for conservation or even for sustainable forest management, but the amount of resources in the field for enforcement are not adequate enough to actually make sure it happens. So that example was incremental resources for enforcement, such that governments have what it takes to actually make sure the laws they already have in place are enforced. I mean, a perfect example, maybe not a perfect example, one example is we work a lot with community forestry tenure and community forestry groups that come together, oftentimes working collectively with governments. And their tenure is secured and they have some resources in place to do their own patrolling. But they oftentimes, if they find people who have come into their areas, don't have anyone to actually bring them to. And that's not because the government doesn't have a law that says you can't go in there and illegally log. So I think what we really mean by that enforcement is not there's REDD enforcement and non-REDD enforcement, but if one of the drivers of deforestation is illegal logging due to the fact that enforcement is not effective because resources are too small, you would budget for incremental resources in that area. That's what we meant. And thanks, we'll make that clearer in the paper and the presentation. All right, we have one more presentation before lunch. I'm going to hand it back to Mario. Thank you, everyone.
Gracias, Leslie.